Hi guys, welcome to the tutorial for the Tiffany corset. I'm going to show you step by step how you can make this exact same corset at home. This is one of my favorite patterns. It is inspired by 17th and 18th century stays. You can see I've made it twice in this beautiful jacquard fabric that I absolutely love. I wore this to an event. I love this pattern. I can't wait for you guys to make this for yourself at home. This is of course available at my Etsy shop. The link is in my bio. It comes in sizes extra small through 3XL. It also has a written tutorial that you guys can follow along with. Make sure you check out the size chart and the materials to figure out what size you want to make. This will also come in formats A0, US letter, and A4, so check out those printing instructions. And once you have everything printed and cut out, meet me back here and we'll get started sewing. So here you can see I have all of my pattern pieces. There are quite a few. I made sure to put in the info that this is definitely a more advanced pattern. There's a lot of sewing. It is worth it. It ends up being very pretty. But again, we're going to take this step by step. And our very first step is to interface all of our pieces. This is just going to add strength to our corset. It's going to help with wrinkles, and it's just going to make sure it holds up really well. So make sure you have an interfacing or some sort of strength layer for your corset. Once you've done that to all of your pieces, including the bust gussets, I do interface those as well as the hip pieces. We're going to take this and we're going to start with one side, and specifically we're going to start with the front on one side. We kind of do this in fourths. So we'll do the front, then the back, connect those two, and then do our other side and connect those two. So we're starting with the front. More specifically, we're starting with our center front panel piece and our bust gusset number 1. And we're going to take those and place them right sides facing, pin in place, and sew down. Now it does say on your pattern this has a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so you can remember we are sewing all of these pattern pieces with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And once I have this pinned in place, I'm just going to take this to my sewing machine and sew it down. Once that's sewn down, we are going to take our seam allowance and we're going to press that towards our bust gusset piece. So again, we're pressing it towards the bust piece for our seam allowance. It's important to pay attention in the instructions in the video tutorial for which way we're pressing our seam allowance, because we are going to then take that seam allowance and sew it down. So we're sewing it towards the bust gusset. So it will look like this once you're done. And we'll continue to sew and press our seam allowances in different directions as we keep going. Again, this is pretty advanced, so there are some different directions going on. But once we've done this, we're going to take our side front one and we are going to press it up against that center front and then also our bust gusset one. And we are going to pin this into place. Make sure you're starting from the top because our seam allowances go in different directions, especially the next piece. It will kind of look like they don't match up at the bottom, but that's because we still have to sew our seam allowance down. So make sure you're pinning from the top down when you do this. Once that's all pinned in place, we are just going to sew those together. Now that that one's done, we are going to press once again. Now I like to use a little tailoring ham that helps just get the curves. And we are going to press our seam allowance towards our side front one. So all of the seam allowance is going away from the center front and towards our side front one. Again, this is important to make sure you're pressing your seam allowance in the correct direction because we are going to sew it down into place once this has been pressed. And this is one of those channels where our boning is actually going to go through. Once we've sewn our seam allowance down, it should look like this. You can see I have my center front, my side front one, and my bust gusset, and all my seam allowance is sewn down. We're going to set that aside right now, and we're going to grab our side front 2, and we are going to connect the gusset, the bust gusset 2 to our side front 2 at that side part right there. So we're going to take these, place them right side spacing, pin into place, and then we're going to go over to our sewing machine and sew those together. And then we are going to take our tailoring ham, we're going to press the seam allowance towards the bust gusset. So just kind of like how we did with the center front, we're going to take that seam allowance, press it towards the bust gusset number 2. And once we do that, we're going to take it over to our sewing machine and we are going to sew down our seam allowance. It should look like this once you're done. Our seam allowance is sewn down. And now we're going to take that piece and we're going to connect it with our first piece that we started, which is our center front and our side front and our bust gusset 1. We're going to take this and place it right sides facing against our side front 2 and our bust gusset 2 and pin this all the way down, again starting at the top. Make sure you don't start from the bottom because our seam allowance is going to go in certain directions so that everything evens out once our seam allowance is sewn down. So make sure you're starting from the top when you are pinning into place. And once you have that all pinned into place, we'll take this over to our sewing machine and we will sew that down. Now we're going to take our seam allowance and we're going to press this towards the center front. So this is going towards the center front. Again, I like to use the tailoring ham for the cut part because it's curved, and then I just use without the tailoring ham to press the rest of the seam allowance again towards the center front. And once you've done that, we are going to sew it down into place. Now our next step is to attach our hip front piece to our front panel that we've just created. But if you are doing the decorative stitch, you are going to do that before you attach your hip piece. So I'm going to do that for all 4 pieces. You don't have to do this decorative stitch. It is completely up to you. It is marked on your pattern if you just want to trace the lines from your pattern, or I like to go in just with a ruler and a heat pen, and they are 0.25 inches apart. And they are going slanted in the direction of where your hip piece is. So if your hip piece is straight, all of your lines will be slanted in the direction that I'm going. And again, this is also marked on your pattern. But once you have all of your lines marked, we're going to take our batting and we're going to just pin this all along your hip piece. You can base stitch this into place. I like to just use a bunch of pins so I know that it's not moving. And this is really just going to help accentuate those sewing lines so you really see all of the detail that you put into this. Again, this is optional. It is a lot of sewing. It's some extra steps, but it does make for a really cute detail in your corset. Once you've got all of that batting pinned down, connected to your hip piece, we are just going to sew along all of those lines. Now this is a lot of sewing. I find the easiest way to do this is to do it in one continuous stitch. And the way that I do that is I go straight down my line, keep my needle in, as you can see, put my presser foot up, and then I go horizontal and then keep my needle foot down, put my presser foot up, and then go down that line once more. So I just continuously go up and down and up and down, and I don't ever take my needle or my presser foot or my thread out. I just do this in one continuous stitch. This is the fastest way to do this. It is, again, a lot of sewing, especially because you need to repeat this for all of your hip pieces. So you'll do this 4 total times, but I'll show you what it looks like and what I mean by I do this in one continuous stitch. So here is my hip piece done. You can see how that batting really helps bring out the stitching so you can really see the details. This is how you can see I did this in one continuous stitch. I didn't have to pull up my needle and continuously go over and over again, and it really is the fastest way. Make sure you go ahead and repeat that for all of your hip pieces because we're going to want to do that before you connect it to any of your front or back. But once you've got that hip piece done, I have my front hip right here. I'm going to take that and place it right sides facing against my front panel pieces that I have already created, and I'm going to pin that into place, and then I'm going to sew it down. Once that's been done, I am just going to press that seam allowance flat. We're not going to be sewing down the seam allowance. It is just going to be pressed flat and open. Now that your front part is done, we're actually going to go ahead and get started on the back. Again, we're kind of doing this in 4th pieces. So we did the front, now we're going to head to the back. We're going to take our center back and our side back. We are going to place them right sides facing, and we are going to pin into place all the way from top to bottom. And once those are all pinned, we are just going to take this over to our sewing machine and sew those 2 pieces together. Once those are sewn, we are going to take our seam allowance and we are going to press it towards the center back, again, towards the center back. Once that's been pressed, you're going to sew down your seam allowance and create that back channel. Now we're just going to grab our back hip piece. You can see I've already done my sewing lines on that one. And I'm going to take this and I'm going to place it right side facing against my side back piece. I'm going to pin this down into place. And then once I have that all pinned, I'm going to sew these two together. Once that's sewn, just like we did with our other hip piece, we are going to press that seam allowance open and flat. Now we're going to grab our front piece once again, and we are going to connect our back to our front. So we're going to take these and place them right sides facing, and we're going to pin all the way from the top to the bottom. And once we have that all pinned into place, we will sew our front piece to our back piece. Now again, for the side, just like we did with our two hip pieces, we're actually going to press our seam allowance open and make sure it is nice and flat. We're going to press this again open, and we're actually going to sew down both of those seam allowances. So you're doing the front side and the back side. So I'll go over this twice. As you can see, I sew down the back seam allowance and the front seam allowance. Once that's done, you've actually completed one whole side. Our next step is just to repeat all of those steps. So make sure you go back if you need to, see what steps you need to remember. And we're just going to repeat the exact same thing and do our next side. Once you've got that done, we are going to connect our sides at the center front. We're going to take those, place them right sides facing on top of each other, pin in place all the way from the top to the bottom, and then we will sew our two sides together. Similar to how we did with our sides, we are going to press this center front seam open, and we're going to create two channels. So we're going to sew down each of these. So we have our right side and our left side. We're going to create two channels, and we're going to sew the seam allowance down for both of those. So I'm going to go ahead and sew down one side all the way down, and then I'm going to flip this and I'm going to go down the opposite side and sew down that seam allowance from top to bottom. Once this is done, you should have a pretty complete main fabric corset. And we're just going to repeat, again, all of those steps for our lining. So the only thing you can skip is obviously that decorative stitch on the hips, but we are going to do the exact same things for our lining. Now you can set your lining aside for now. We have a couple more steps for our main fabric corset, and one of those would be cutting and placing all of our boning pieces. Now to cut your boning pieces, you're going to want to hold this up against the seam, and you're going to want to make sure you have about 3/4 of an inch from the top and 3/4 of an inch from the bottom. So I'm doing this for each of my channels. We have two in that center front. We have two of these side ones and then side twos. And then we have those actual sides. We have two in each side, so 4 total. And then we also have those back pieces, and we'll have 2 more that we'll talk about later. That is a lot of boning. You have a lot of channels. I like my corset really sturdy, especially because this was inspired by a stay. You do not have to put all of that boning. I would definitely suggest doing the center front. I would suggest doing the side front twos and the back boning pieces. But if you want to skip some of those, you can, especially if you feel like your corset is sturdy enough. But I like to put these again in each of my channels. And before I place my boning pieces, I also tape off the ends. You can see I'm doing that here. I definitely suggest taping off your ends, or if you have steel cage, that you cap those. And this helps prevent the boning from poking out when you're wearing it. But once you've done that, we are just going to put all of our boning pieces into all of their respective channels. So once you've cut all of your pieces, tapped off those edges, just start placing your boning into where they belong. Once you've done this for all of your boning pieces, you can see I have that completely boned right here. Now I'm going to grab my lining again. I'm going to place it right sides facing on top of my main fabric corset, and I'm going to pin this all along the top edge and both sides. When I pin this, I like to make sure I'm aligning all of the seams. So make sure the seam of your main fabric and the seam of your lining fabric corset are kind of at the exact same point. So I like to go in, pin those, and then I'll kind of go in and pin the rest, and then I'll pin the sides. But you want to make sure that all of those seams are aligning. Make sure you go ahead and pin both of those sides as well as the top. And once you have everything pinned into place for your main fabric and your lining, again with right side spacing, we are going to sew this down. Once we've sewn our main fabric and our lining corset, I like to trim off those corners. This just helps them get a little bit sharper. And then I also like to put little snips in the curves at that top edge. This just helps it lay a little flatter. Make sure you're not snipping your sewing. Get right up to that sewing line, but make sure you don't accidentally snip any of your sewing. But this is gonna help once we finally take this and put it right sides out. Everything is gonna sit just slightly flatter with those little snips in the curves. So I'm gonna put this right sides out. I'm gonna flip my corset, and once I do this, I'm going to press the sides and that top edge to make sure they're nice and flat. And then I like to do a top stitch along the edge. I only do the top edge, not the sides. This is optional if you don't like any top stitching, but I like to do a little top stitch all along that top edge of my corset. Once that top edge is done, remember I said we had one more boning channel. This is marked on your pattern, but if you don't have it marked, it is 0.5 inches away from your center back, and we'll do this for both center back pieces. So I am just taking a heat pen and I am marking that line. And once I have it marked, I am going to sew down that line. This is going to be our last channel for our last two boning pieces. And this is going to be the boning piece that your grommets go up against. So here I'm just sewing right down that line to create my channel. And again, we will do this for both of your back pieces. So make sure you repeat that sewing. Then we're just going to cut our boning piece. I've already got part of it cut, but we're gonna make sure it starts 3/4 an inch from the bottom and right below where we sewed that top stitch if you did a top stitch, or right at the top of your corset. So you only need to make sure you have that at the bottom because that part isn't sewn. And you're gonna cut two of those. Make sure you tape off those ends. And once you've got your boning piece ready, we're just going to insert that into that last channel, and we're going to repeat that for our other back paneling piece. Once those last boning pieces are done, we are going to work on finishing up the bottom of our corset. We are going to do that with a bias tape. Make sure you get your bias tape ready if you're making it, or grab your bias tape if you bought it. But to start, to make things a little bit easier, I just like to do a quick base stitch to combine the lining and the main fabric corset just at the bottom where they're not combined yet. Make sure you align all of those seams. So I like to make sure the seam of my main fabric corset and the seam of my lining are all at the same place, and I'll just go through and pin this all the way along. And then again, I'm just going to do a base stitch to combine the lining to the main fabric corset. Once I've got that base stitched, again, I didn't record the base stitch because we're just doing that really quickly. I'm going to grab my bias tape. So I've got that right here. I'm going to unfold one side and I'm going to place it right side spacing with the bottom edges aligning to my main fabric corset. I like to take that edge and wrap it around so that the right sides are facing of the bias tape around my main fabric corset. And then I just start pinning into place all the way along. I like to use a lot of pins for this. I feel like bias tape, and when you get to the end, it's really easy to start messing up or go like quickly. But I think those finishings are really what make things look a little bit more professional. So try to take your time with the bias tape. I know it's annoying because it's like one of the last steps, but once we're done with the bias tape, that is your last bit of sewing. We just have to put our grommets in. And again, once we get to the end, make sure you wrap. So I'm going to cut off the excess that I have here, and I'm going to take the ends of my bias tape and I'm just going to wrap that around my main fabric corset so that the right sides of the bias tape are touching each other. and I'm gonna pin that into place. Once I have this now all pinned into place, I will take that over to my sewing machine, and I'm just sewing that 0.5 inches, that bottom part of the bias tape, down to my corset. Now that that's all sewn, I'm going to take my bias tape and I am going to flip this. Make sure you get those corners. They're going to be flipped inside, and then also you're flipping down the raw edge of the bias tape, and we're flipping that towards the lining of your corset. So it's going to look kind of like this. You'll start to see it a little bit more as I continue, but it should look neat from the inside and the outside of your corset. And again, I like to use a lot of pins when I do this because it just helps it look nice and neat. So I pin a lot before I sew my bias tape down, and I will continue this all the way down to the other edge of my corset. Once everything has been pinned into place, it should look something like this, and we're going to take this and we're going to sew down that edge with our sewing machine, and we're going to finish off our bias tape. You can see what it looks like from the front, and we're going to go ahead and sew that down. I like to sew from the front. I think it helps look a little bit neater. I'm more worried about the front looking neat than I am the inside, but you want to make sure both are evenly pinned, so it should look good from both sides. And that is your last sewing step. You are almost done. So now we are just going to mark our grommets. So I am using a 1/4 inch grommet, and I'm spacing them 1 inch apart, and they start 0.5 inches from the top of your corset. You do not have to use my spacing. This is also marked on your pattern, but if you want to use a different size grommet or change up your spacing, you are more than welcome to. Maybe you only had 1/2 inch grommets and you need to change up your spacing. Please go ahead, do whatever you need to do, but if you like my spacing, it is marked on your pattern, or you can mark it with a ruler later on with your heat pen. Again, they start 0.5 inches down from the top edge, and they are spaced 1 inch apart. But once you have all your grommets marked, you're either going to take a grommet press, or you can buy a grommet kit and use a hammer, and you're just going to place all of those grommets into the back of your corset. Make sure they're up against that boning piece, that's going to make it nice and sturdy. And then all you need to do is just lace up your corset, and that is your very last step. I hope you guys found this tutorial as well as the instructions helpful. Let me know what you think. Make sure you follow along for more pattern releases. I will always try to do video tutorials with my patterns because I think they really help you guys just in case you get stuck or in case you're more of a visual learner. I hope you love this corset. Again, I've already made it twice and worn it to an event. I love this corset. I think it's very unique, and I love that it's inspired by those 17th and 18th century stays. Let me know what you guys think, and again, follow along for more pattern releases.